The coolest car features from the past are now completely banned. These design choices defined entire generations of vehicles. Some killed more people than you would think. Safety regulations eventually caught up with deadly designs. Chrome mascots, gleaming pop-up headlights, and spiked hubcaps once drew crowds on showroom floors. These details turned cars into rolling art, each projection a statement of confidence and style. But beneath the shine, these features carried a hidden cost. In the 1980s and the 1990s, pedestrian injury data began to reveal a pattern. Sharp ornaments and movable lamp covers were turning minor accidents into life-altering trauma. The Lotus Esprit, famous for its dual pop-up headlights, became a casualty of this reckoning. Production ended in 2004, the same year the European Union made movable front lighting illegal for new cars. The regulations cited head impact severity, requiring that no lamp or ornament could protrude more than 30 millimeters from the body. Engineers at Lotus had no choice but to retire the design. In the United States, federal standards set by FMVSS 108 mirrored the same logic, demanding fixed, energy-absorbing surfaces by the late 1990s. Hood ornaments faced a similar fate. The Jaguar Leaper, once a symbol of British luxury, was re-engineered after lawsuits and injury reports in the early 2000s. By 2005, Jaguar switched to a collapsible flush-mounted emblem to comply with new European crash standards. The days of rigid chrome mascots were over. Spike hubcaps, once popular on custom Cadillacs and hot rods, drew the attention of city councils and safety agencies. Los Angeles banned all projectile-type wheel accessories in 1975, followed by New York and Texas. By the 1990s, federal rules limited any wheel accessory to a 12mm protrusion. The rationale was blunt. At city speeds, spiked hubcaps could turn a glancing blow into a deep laceration or worse. Projectile wheel ornaments had become a public safety issue. Each of these features was admired for its flair, but injury statistics forced a reckoning. The glamour of protruding icons faded as regulations closed in, setting the stage for a new era of car design, one where safety, not spectacle, would decide what belonged on the road. Chrome bumpers once promised strength and style, their mirror-like surfaces a fixture on American roads from the 1950s into the early 1980s. But behind the shine, a problem lurked. Rigid metal bumpers, when struck at low speeds, sent nearly all the impact energy straight into the car's frame and into people. In 1973, Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 581 set a clear line. Bumpers had to withstand a 5 mph collision without significant damage. Automakers responded by making bumpers thicker and mounts stiffer, but the result was a front end that refused to give. Instead of absorbing crashes, these bumpers amplified them, increasing the risk of broken bones and internal injuries, even at speeds where survival should have been routine. By the 1990s, crash data made the failure impossible to ignore. Studies showed chrome-plated steel bumpers raised the chances of lower leg fractures and head injuries in pedestrian impacts. The European Union's 2005 UNECE 126 regulation forced a change, requiring soft, energy-absorbing bumpers on new cars. In the US, manufacturers phased out chrome for plastic and composites that could crumple and spread out force. The era of rigid shine faded, replaced by bumpers built for survival, not spectacle. Decorative antenna whips faced a similar fate. For decades, long metal rods snapped in the wind, but in a crash, they often broke loose, causing lacerations and even deaths. Insurance records from the 1970s and the 1980s linked dozens of injuries to antenna detachment. By the late 1990s, new rules limited antenna length and required flexible designs. By the early 2000s, embedded and shark fin antennas became standard, quietly ending the chrome whip's run. The shift from rigid shine to energy absorption was driven by hard evidence. Crash tests, injury stats, and legal pressure left no room for nostalgia. Windshield-mounted spotlights once gave drivers a sense of command, their chrome housings jutting out from A-pillars or rooflines. But these auxiliary lamps did more than light up a dark road. they carved blind spots directly into the driver's forward view. By the early 1970s, state vehicle codes began to restrict or outright ban civilian windshield spotlights. California's Vehicle Code Section 25650, for example, limited auxiliary lights to emergency vehicles and required others to be disconnected or removed before passing inspection. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 101, updated in 1991, prohibited any auxiliary lighting that could impair driver visibility, effectively ending their use on new passenger cars. Rear window louvers arrived in the late 1970s as a styling cue borrowed from racing, promising shade and privacy. But the metal slats cut rearward visibility by as much as 40% in controlled sightline studies. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration responded with Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 111 in 1999, mandating a clear, unobstructed view through the rear glass. Inspection limits soon followed in most states, barring any aftermarket accessory that blocked more than a narrow percentage of the window. By the early 2000s, rear louvers vanished from dealer options and faded into the aftermarket fringe. Swing-out spare tire carriers, popular on early SUVs and family wagons, created their own hazard. Extending well past the rear bumper, these steel arms turned minor rear-end collisions into major accidents. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 581, as amended in 1994, set a strict rear overhang limit of 120 millimeters for passenger cars. Manufacturers responded by tucking spares under the body or inside the trunk, eliminating the battering ram effect of an external carrier. Crash data from the 1990s confirmed the wisdom of these changes. Rear impact injury rates dropped as overhangs shrank and sightlines improved. Each of these features once promised convenience or flair, but the evidence told a different story. As sightline studies and crash statistics made the risks clear, regulations forced designers to choose visibility and safety over nostalgia. The result was a quieter revolution, one measured in fewer collisions, clearer views, and lives spared. A wave of innovation once swept through car interiors, but not all progress was safe. For decades, dashboards and instrument panels were built from solid metal or covered in glass, turning the front of the car into a collection of blunt hazards. In a collision, the human head becomes a projectile, stopping suddenly against an unyielding surface. Dr. David Viano, a leading biomechanics expert, documented the physics at play. When a person's head strikes a steel dashboard at 30 miles per hour, the deceleration can exceed 80 G, delivering enough force to fracture the skull or cause fatal brain injury. Viano's research showed that patting the dashboard dropped peak head force by 2.3 kilonewtons, a difference that often meant survival instead of death. Crash data from the 1970s and the 1980s revealed a pattern. Drivers and passengers suffered deep lacerations, concussions, and facial fractures when their faces met the hard, unyielding dash or shattered glass instrument panels. Congressional hearings in 1976 brought these findings to the public, with testimony describing how even low-speed crashes could leave survivors with life-altering injuries. The numbers were stark. Before padding became standard, dashboards accounted for over a third of all serious facial trauma and frontal crashes. The industry responded. By the late 1970s, new federal standards required energy-absorbing materials for all interior surfaces. Polycarbonate and laminated plastics replaced glass in gauge faces, virtually eliminating the risk of flying shards. By the 1980s, every major automaker had swapped shiny metal for padded vinyl and foam. By the end of that decade, even the most luxurious models had left hard surfaces behind. The science was clear. A few centimeters of padding could mean the difference between a bruised forehead and a fatal injury. These changes, driven by biomechanics and crash test evidence, transformed the car interior from a chamber of hidden dangers into a survivable space. In the years before federal mandates, American cars rolled off assembly lines with no seatbelts and bare metal seatbacks, luxury coupes, family sedans, even sports cars. The logic was simple. Safety was a personal choice, not a manufacturer's duty. But behind that freedom, the toll was mounting. Hospital records from the 1950s and the 1960s documented thousands of deaths and life-altering injuries every year, many of them preventable. Whiplash, spinal fractures, and ejections from the cabin became grimly routine. Ralph Nader's 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed, forced the country to confront this crisis. He called out the industry's refusal to install seatbelts, writing, "The main cause of automobile injuries was not the driver, but the inherent engineering and design deficiencies, no seatbelts, flimsy crash structures, and a culture of industrial irresponsibility." Nader's testimony before Congress, broadcast on national television, put a face to the data. Public opinion shifted almost overnight. By 1968, the federal government responded with Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 208, requiring all new cars to have front seat lap and shoulder belts. Resistance from automakers and some drivers was fierce. Seatbelts cut fatal injuries by more than half in head-on collisions. A year later, another invisible hazard came under scrutiny. Decades of crash reports showed that rear-end collisions often left survivors with permanent neck damage, whiplash that could cripple in seconds. In 1969, Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 202 required head restraints on all new cars, setting a minimum height and strength for every front seat. Studies in the early 1970s showed a 40% drop in serious neck injuries after headrests became standard. The era of missing restraints ended not with nostalgia, but with the hard math of survival. Style and tradition gave way to the reality that a simple belt or headrest could mean the difference between walking away and never walking again. For generations, the bench seat defined the American sedan, a wide, uninterrupted cushion stretching from door to door. Families packed in 3 across the front, and taxi drivers praised the simplicity. Even as late as 2013, Chevrolet offered a bench seat in the Impala, clinging to a tradition that had already vanished from most showrooms. But the end was inevitable. New crash test standards demanded more than nostalgia could provide. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 207, revised in 2010, required every seat position to offer head restraints at least 150 millimeters high. The classic bench, with its low back and flat profile, simply could not comply. Side impact, AIR bags, and 3-point belts needed fixed anchor points and defined seating positions. By 2013, the last Impala rolled off the line without a factory bench, closing the book on an era. Rear-facing third-row seats, once a staple in station wagons, followed a similar path. These seats, tucked into the cargo area, placed children with their backs to the road and their faces inches from the tailgate. When new regulations demanded forward-facing seats and full restraint systems in all rows, the rear-facing design disappeared almost overnight. Modern child safety anchorage and ISOFIX requirements made the old wagon layout impossible to certify. Steering columns tell the same story of forced evolution. Early designs used rigid steel shafts that turned head on collisions into fatal spearing events. In 1978, a new mandate required energy-absorbing columns that collapse under force, cutting the risk of chest and neck injuries by nearly half. By the 1990s, collapsible designs became universal, paired with AR bags that demanded a clear, predictable path for deployment. Chip Foose, a collector and customizer, remembers the bench seat as a symbol of American freedom, a place where style, comfort, and utility met. But as crash science advanced, the old layouts could not survive. Airbag trajectories, belt anchor geometry, and head restraint height are now engineered with precision, leaving no room for the features that once made cars feel like rolling living rooms. The shift from shared cushions and rigid columns to bucket seats and collapsing shafts is more than a technicality. It is the story of survival, written in steel and foam. In 1971, Ford introduced the Pinto as a symbol of affordable, everyday driving. Beneath its compact frame, a critical flaw lurked. The fuel tank sat just behind the rear axle, shielded only by a thin metal panel. Crash tests revealed the danger. At just 25 miles per hour, a rear-end collision could rupture the tank, spilling gasoline and igniting fires. Internal documents showed Ford weighed the cost of fixing the design, $11 per car, against the likely expense of legal settlements. The calculation favored profit over safety. On American roads, the consequences were swift and brutal. Dozens of crashes ended in flames, with survivors bearing life-altering burns. In 1977, a Mother Jones investigation exposed the Pinto's vulnerability, and Clarence Ditlow of the Center for Auto Safety pressed federal agencies to act. Ditlow's findings traced a clear line. Ford had known and chosen not to act. Public outrage mounted, leading to a congressional inquiry and a formal investigation by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. On June 9, 1978, Ford recalled 1.5 million Pintos and 30,000 Mercury Bobcats. The fix, a plastic shield and reinforced brackets, was simple, but the impact was profound. The recall gave the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration new power to order corrections for defects that posed an unreasonable risk of death or injury. The Pinto was not alone. Throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, other shortcuts in design proved deadly. Many sedans and coupes lacked internal door beams, leaving passengers exposed in side impact crashes. Thin sheet metal offered little resistance, and victims suffered severe chest and abdominal injuries. By the late 1980s, studies showed that cars without side beams faced a 30% higher rate of fatal thoracic trauma in T-bone collisions. In response, regulators mandated side impact protection for all passenger vehicles, beginning with the 1990 model year. Every new car had to withstand a lateral impact at 15 miles per hour, with reinforced door structures as standard. Roof design posed its own risks. The vinyl-covered Landau roofs of the era, chosen for their style, hid frames that collapsed under rollover pressure. NHTSA crash data revealed that these roofs often tore away, exposing occupants to crushing injuries. Fatalities spiked in convertibles and hardtops with decorative coverings. By the late 1980s, federal standards forced automakers to strengthen roof pillars, and the vinyl roof quietly disappeared from catalogs. Each failure, fuel tank, door, and roof, forced change. Today, regulations demand that fuel tanks survive 30 miles per hour, rear impacts, side doors resist intrusion, and roofs withstand rollover forces. The era of catastrophic structures ended through evidence, litigation, and the persistence of advocates like Clarence Ditlow. Early cars hid dangers in plain sight. Ordinary glass, chosen for its clarity and cost, shattered on impact, sending razor-sharp fragments flying through the cabin. In the 1950s and early 1960s, hospitals treated thousands of drivers and passengers each year for deep cuts, eye injuries, and deaths caused by ejection through windshields. Crash data from that era made it clear being thrown through glass was among the deadliest outcomes in a collision. The need for a safer solution was urgent and undeniable. Change arrived in 1966 with Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 205. Laminated glass, two sheets fused with a thin plastic layer, became mandatory for all new windshields in the United States. This design kept broken glass in place, even under violent force. The results were immediate. Studies from the late 1960s found a 70% drop in severe lacerations and a sharp decline in ejection deaths. By 1968, every new car sold in America had to meet this standard, and similar requirements soon appeared in Europe and Japan. The era of glass splinters and silent lethal projectiles was ending. But while one hazard was being sealed away, another remained invisible. From the 1920s through the mid-1990s, nearly every car ran unleaded gasoline. Tetraethyl lead improved engine performance but left a toxic residue. By the 1970s, air in American cities carried high levels of lead dust, settling on playgrounds and drifting into homes. Pediatricians noticed children living near busy roads showed higher blood lead levels, with consequences ranging from learning delays to permanent brain damage. By the mid-1980s, the Centers for Disease Control estimated that almost 90% of American children had unsafe blood lead concentrations. Industry resistance slowed reform, but mounting evidence forced action. In 1996, the U.S. banned leaded gasoline for on-road vehicles. Within 5 years, average blood lead levels in children fell by more than 80%. The air cleared, and a silent epidemic began to fade. Glass and fuel, materials chosen for visibility and power, brought risks that only tragedy and data could reveal. Regulations followed wounds and loss, not just caution. Today, the glass that holds us in and the fuel that moves us are engineered to protect, not harm. The details we romanticize, like chrome dashboards or pop-up headlights, once masked deadly flaws. Federal safety rules, from the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards to the Pinto recalls, rewrote what's acceptable in our cars. Today, every design choice is shadowed by the lives lost before reform. We inherit safer roads not by nostalgia, but by learning from tragedy. The next feature we admire should never cost another life. Share your thoughts below.